Well, welcome to Our World Today, a progressive, left progressive political show, imagining a better tomorrow. I'm Suzanne Linton.
Welcome back, Suzanne.
Welcome,
And
Dave, Jeff, and Dave. And I'm back after 4 months or so in Brazil. So
Yeah, we feel so sorry for you.
it was really hard. You know, that tropical weather, you just have to suffer through it. 80 degrees all the time.
And you left Brazil just before the World Cup. How could you? How could you?
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
But seriously, a lot of people said that to me.
I know. It's a big deal.
How could you?
Yeah.
It's so big, such a big deal there. Because there's only one sport, really, as you said, as we were going on. Yes, everybody's into soccer. And it isn't something sometimes that the women aren't into it either. I mean, everybody.
Everybody, yeah.
So
Big deal.
they're very excited about it.
So we probably won't say too much about the World Cup on this show, but we could. It'll certainly be on the media.
Yes.
Even
and there are a
country.
lot of political demonstrations going on, too. That's
actually,
quite
that's very interesting. I might have some remarks.
Yeah, we
on
might
that.
have to talk about that because the politics, just like in this country, the politics of stadiums, the politics of the infrastructure devoted to sports, and as Dave and I were saying off the air, sports in some ways, in the 21st century, sports is of even more interest to corporations than media, newspapers and TV stations, because sports is so good at doing what media was created to do, which is gather people's eyeballs to the advertisements. And sports gathers enormous numbers of eyeballs around the world. And certainly the most popular sport in the world is what most of the world calls football. We call soccer.
Exactly. Fujiball.
Right. And the advertisements are there the entire time, all around the field.
And even, let's not talk too much about
But
it.
anyway, they're not building just one stadium. I mean, they're all over the country.
Manaus and Recife
Amazon and Salvador
everywhere.
and Rio.
It's unbelievable.
Everywhere.
But anyway, it's
we
good
need
to have you
mention.
back.
Yes.
We need to mention also that this is the beginning of our 10th year.
Yeah, we've been.
We began
this,
this
the three
show
of
in
us,
June.
yes.
The three of us together began in June 6, 2005.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we've been doing it for 9 years, and this is the first. On
So
a
just think, there's some young
10th
people
year.
who've probably grown up with us.
You know, they might not think of it that way, but still.
Well, maybe they have it. Their political understanding.
There might be some viewers who have looked at us and questioned the concept of us growing up. So anyway. We have a few headlines to start out the show. We've been starting out the show with headlines lately, and I'll try to keep them brief. But one headline in the last month, during the month of May 2014, was on May 27th, President Obama made some remarks, released a statement on the so-called war in Afghanistan. I always stress it hasn't been a war since 2001. It's been an occupation. The war was over almost immediately.
And
what you might call a
Afghanistan
war.
has yet to attack us, if I
Right,
recall.
it doesn't seem like it's kind of a one-sided thing.
Really?
So Obama announced a plan last week. We're on the air live on June 2nd. So last week, as we're speaking here, Obama announced his plan to keep 9,800 U.S. troops in Afghanistan after 2014. That was the headline in the London Guardian. And their lead paragraph was quite different than the ones we saw in the United States. Their lead paragraph was, President Obama announced Tuesday that he will leave 9,800 U.S. troops in Afghanistan through much of next year and backed away from ending America's longest war until at least his final year in office. Now, the coverage in this country didn't emphasize that he was backing away from anything. It was sort of a celebratory, we are ending what he calls ending combat operations in 2014 as promised. But the promise really, as I recall, was to pull combat troops out by 2014. But we're not. We're pulling out all but 9,800. 9,800 is a lot of troops.
That's what I
And
thought.
supposedly, they won't be doing any direct combat. They'll be training, supervising, et cetera, but they retain the right, depending on the final wording, if it's signed, of the Status of Forces Agreement. They still may be supervising and have an unclear role in night raids and things like that. And will, of course, be more or less immune from prosecution for any crimes they might commit. And Obama included one statement in his, or one sentence in his statement, which I think is worth quoting, when he said that we have to recognize that Afghanistan will not be a perfect place, and it is not America's responsibility to make it one. The future of Afghanistan must be decided by Afghans. But what the United States can do, what we will do, is secure our interests and help give the Afghans a chance, an opportunity to seek a long, overdue, and hard-earned peace. I almost don't even know what to say about that. Because here we have the commander-in-chief of a nation that has conducted an invasion and military occupation of a country for almost 13 years, saying that what his country can do is help give the Afghans a chance to seek peace. It's just mind-boggling.
Yes.
And again, the next day, we'll talk about this a little bit later, the president made in a big speech at West Point, made a comment that our military has become the strongest advocate for diplomacy and development in Iraq and Afghanistan. War is peace, in other words.
Yeah.
Yes.
And again, I think the main thing to note about his statement is that the decision about what is a perfect place rests in the hands of the U.S. as the great power.
Right.
And that is what we call colonial or neo-colonial thinking, that we reserve the right to decide what is best for others and impose our will by military force or other force.
Well, and there was something in his speech, too, that he implied such a thing. Didn't he also say, you know, that we were going to be the leaders of the world always? And
we'll talk about that. That was in his
that's
West Point
right,
speech.
yes,
Definitely,
right,
he talked leadership many times.
Right.
Yeah.
But I noticed in there also, we will secure our interests. Is that
Yeah,
how
yeah,
it was
that's-
put? Yes.
yeah.
Which, you know, I wonder how
It
would
kind of
feel
conflicts with
if
their
some
interests
country
in-
left 10,000 troops here to secure their interests in the United States. It was,
And
this
90% of the opium in the world comes out of Afghanistan.
Yes, it does.
And it's a big,
Yes.
it's a big one for us, for the CIA.
That's certainly an interest, yes.
A story that came out on May 13th in the Star-Tribune was a very tragic story, actually. As a young football player from Mankato, Minnesota, who had played at the university named Philip Nelson, and he was involved in a altercation, I guess you could say, late at night, in the wee hours of the morning, outside of a bar where he kicked another football player, not from his team, but from a Mankato team, I guess, in the head. He was punched and then kicked in the head. He's now in an induced coma still.
Yeah.
And a very tragic situation. The story that ran, the front page headline in the Star-Tribune that ran on this, reporting on the story, read like this: "Flurry of blows leaves 2 lives in ruins. Ex-gopher freed on bail in assault outside Mankato bar." 2 days later, an op-ed appeared in the Star-Tribune by a writer asking, why are we equating the attacked and his attacker? And he points out the racial aspect of it, because the person doing the kicking is white, the guy being kicked is black, and the op-ed piece points it out. So, he points out, too, that the Star-Tribune also shows a picture of Philip Nelson, as the quarterback's name, a picture of Philip Nelson's father with the story. He is gravely concerned, and his visage contributes to our ability to see this situation from the perspective of the Nelsons. And the next day in the sports pages, Star-Tribune columnist Patrick Royce devoted his column to Nelson. Quote, the headline, "Future was bright once upon a time in Mankato." He recounted Nelson's heroics in high school and his once bright future. He closes the piece with, "There's a 24-year-old Isaac Kolstad in critical condition, and Philip Nelson is charged in the assault. A few seconds and lives ruined. Dang almighty." Again, the parallel of 2 lives ruined. And I think it's a very good point. But I think there's a danger in this interpretation that the op-ed person is writing, because I think some people might say there shouldn't be any sympathy for Philip Nelson. No. And I think actually the reason this is an outstanding example of sort of subtle, unconscious racism, I think, is that the absence of such empathy and compassion for many, many, many other people who similarly get involved in altercations, fly off the handle, get involved in violent situations, and do commit crimes, but coming from a place where, not to condone it, but like here, you see that this is a tragic instance for everybody involved. And not to compare the tragedy of being kicked in the head by the tragedy of being charged with assault.
I mean, the guy is in awful shape and will never come close
will
to
never
recovering.
recover fully,
No.
and may not recover at all.
I
He
mean,
might
they've
not
removed
make
parts
it.
of his brain. I mean, it's
So
awful.
there's no
Just
equating
is.
in that sense, but I don't argue with the idea that the media might at least attempt to say that this was a tragic situation for everybody involved, and yet to equate the physical violence with the person who perpetrated the violence is really would almost be inconceivable if the roles were reversed and the kicker was a non-famous, non-star, non-white, familiar figure from all the sports pages and everything. I think the coverage might have been different. So I think the media really has to keep on their toes about things like that.
Because his prospects were so good.
Right, exactly.
And you know, the black guy who, you know, shoots another person in the neighborhood, well, you know, that was going to happen anyway.
Right.
And of course, we don't know with this person whether this is something that happened once on the spur of the moment or is a result of a life of crime or a you know, a pattern of picking fights in bars or whatever. So I mean, we just don't know that about them, but we assume because they are white and they're a football hero that they're not like that. And therefore, you know, it's one moment that caused this. Now that's never considered the case in a drive-by shooting. That one moment when he fired the shot and his life was destroyed.
Right.
You know, it's very different.
There's a lot of news in the last month and a half or so about the Bring Back Our Girls, which is the situation where on April 15th, somewhere around 300 schoolgirls, teenagers, were kidnapped in Nigeria by the group Boko Haram. It's become, it was a big deal when it was first happened, as it should be, and it's also become, in the interim, a big social media cause celeb, where people are really, really up in arms about this, and justifiably so. What's lost in the media coverage of this, or what's interesting about it, I guess, is that the coverage of this whole incident relies on a conception of terror in which, quote, Islamists are motivated by mysterious reasons, they're just filled with hate, have no respect for human life, and here's another example.
Yes.
The right wing, especially Bill O'Reilly, has really said some horrendous things about this. As always, the real story is more complicated. What the media is not telling us, for the most part, is the origins of Boko Haram, which are not violent originally, something about the divisions within Nigeria, which are not simply between, quote, Islamists and everybody else. There's more to it than that. And of course, something that's almost never talked about is the geopolitics of the situation and the way the United States is, I would say, using or capitalizing on this tragic situation to start inserting forces and to reinforce its already underway plan to have a stronger military and, I guess, covert presence throughout Africa, certainly in West Africa, where there's a lot of oil resources. So I've talked in the past, in Nygaard Notes, years ago I wrote a piece about U.S. media coverage of news from Latin America, and I called it News in 3D. Drugs, disasters, and dictators, because that's what we hear about. And I think we get some of the same thing from Africa, although you might substitute diamonds for drugs. There would be diamonds, disasters, and dictators. And maybe terrorism is really the frame for a lot of it. So I want to recommend to people, if you're following the Boko Haram story, check out a group called IRIN, which I've talked about here before, which is the, IRIN is the...
How do you spell that?
IRIN.
Okay.
Wouldn't you think I'd remember what it stands for? It's International Regional Information Network. I can't remember what the I is for. Anyway, it's out of the UN, and they do, it covers human rights situations in various regions, and you can sign up for it for free email updates. And they have some good stuff. They've had some good stuff on Boko Haram for several years, actually. Boko Haram was created in 2002 as a kind of a political action committee that used young men to get out the vote. They didn't become armed until their leader was assassinated in 2009.
Funny about that.
And they were, well, I just want to read a couple of contrasts just to illustrate this. This is a news headline, so I should keep it brief. But the first contrast is between the BBC and a think tank called the Atlantic Council, not a left-wing group, just a group of specialists. The BBC ran a little sidebar on one of their pieces called Boko Haram at a Glance, 2 points of which were, in this order: 1, Boko Haram is a launched military operations in 2009 to create Islamic State, and founding leader Mohammed Yusuf, killed in 2009, same year, in police custody, succeeded by Abu Bakr Shakal. Well, that's true, but Bronwyn Bruton of the Atlantic Council notes that the origins of this group are complicated. It's not accurate to describe them as just an Islamist extremist group. They were originally peaceful, not until its leader was illegally assassinated in police custody, and the video of his assassination was posted online, that Boko Haram became a militant organization. So again, they have a complicated genesis, she says. The Nigerian government has been excessively brutal in its dealings with Boko Haram. So here we have the sequence was under an onslaught by the government, and assassination, a humiliating assassination and broadcast of the assassination of its leader. Then it turned to a violent thing, not just coincidental, as the BBC implies. That's an important distinction. Yes. Another contrast is between the Los Angeles Times and Al Jazeera. On April 26th, the Los Angeles Times reported that Boko Haram's leader, Mohammed Yusuf, preached an ascetic Muslim lifestyle, including Sharia law, devoid of what he saw as corrupt Western influence. He was killed in 2009 by security forces after being arrested following Boko Haram's first major urban assault on the northeastern city of Maiduguri. Again, the sequence they have is after a Muslim assault, then the leader was killed. The Al Jazeera reported news of Yusuf's death came after the group's deputy leader was reported to be among dozens of people killed after troops shelled Boko Haram's base in the city of Maiduguri. So again, you know, this is a kind of example of, we'll talk a little bit later in the show about how to protect yourself from some of this kind of confusion that comes through the media by educating yourself on some of the background before you dive into the headlines. Because this is the kind of subtle distortions, and sometimes it's more extreme, that you see which came first or who started it, but also what was the sequence of events that gives some meaning to the current events. History is important.
I think also you have to think about, why is this the big story? Some of it is just accidental, you know, somebody starts tweeting something and it catches on. And certainly this is a compelling story. But there are many compelling stories in Nigeria and in Africa. There have been many compelling stories of what has happened to the people who have contested Shell Oil's operations in Nigeria. Stories, I think, just as interesting. Why do some stories come through? And we've heard other ones. The Lost Boys of the Sudan, for instance. And these are intensely personal stories, and I think very compelling. But there's so many other possibilities. We heard no intensely compelling personal story from the wars in the Congo, which are to date the most people killed since World War II in any conflict. We didn't hear those stories. Some of these stories serve some purposes, and I think it's important to wonder, you know, are your emotions being manipulated for some kind of end? And of course, in this case, it's to see Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda, as they're tied with, as simply the ultimate evil. Like in some movie where, you know, Dr. So-and-so is, you know, the evil genius behind something that has no reason except, I suppose, mental illness or something. But, I mean, there are real reasons and real, you know, problems in Nigeria. Problems is a nice way of putting it, that have led to this. I mean, even just a year ago, the United Nations reported that 950 members of Boko Haram died in Nigerian detention just in the first half of the year. So that's 950 people. So what did we hear about that? Did we hear any stories about that? You kind of know what side you... This is a story where you know right away what side you're supposed to be on, and I certainly wouldn't take the side of Boko Haram. But, I mean, what they have done, many of it is really awful, and they use child soldiers, and they, you know, discourage education, but of course then the education is associated with the missionaries that came to Africa, and so there's many things going back a long time. It's much more complex. But we have a simplified story, and I think it's because it's a morality tale. And at the end, everything will be made right, and I fear that it won't, of course, it won't be made right. And the U.S. military is going to have some action in there. or there's going to be some attempt to have some kind of action there. Also, the arming of Boko Haram has a lot to do with the U.S. action and the ultimate outcome in Libya.
Absolutely.
Because these are fairly close. The arms have come across the desert. The rebels in Libya who are associated with al-Qaeda and who were supported by the United States had extra arms after the war is over, and probably could use the money more than the weapons. And those have gone to Boko Haram, and they've also gone very much to Syria. Yeah. That's what that embassy in Benghazi we hear all about, was about funneling those arms to different places in the world, primarily Syria, to somewhat wound up in Boko Haram.
To the rebels.
Yes, to the rebels.
Whatever.
Right. So many of these things are tied together and are just simply not the simple morality tale it's meant. And frankly, just look up Boko Haram in Wikipedia. As much as people knock Wikipedia, at least it gets you to find out that, oh, this group's about 12 years old and it didn't start out as a violent group. That's of real interest. And you can read, 100 tweets and never get that sense.
I actually read a pretty good piece on from National Geographic that gave a lot of the background and context for Boko Haram too, which I was really surprised at. You never know.
Yeah.
But look around. The point is, and we'll get to this later in the show, the point is to not rely on the daily media reporting breaking news because what they won't generally do, or will do in a distorted way often, is to give the context and background that gives meaning to whatever the facts are of the day.
Right.
So that's, but the day after this, so we talked earlier in the headlines about Obama making a statement about Afghanistan. The very next day, on May 28th, Obama gave the commencement speech at the military academy in West Point, the Army Academy, which I think presidents often do. Maybe they do it every year, I don't even know. But it was an attempt, he said, to describe his, quote, vision for how the United States of America and our military should lead in the years to come. And of course, most people sort of haven't even heard about it, I'm sure, but people who do watch the news, it's gotten quite a bit of response, got quite a bit of coverage, including in the right-wing press. And of course, some people in the right wing don't like the president. I'm breaking this news.
Yeah.
But one conservative commentator, Pamela Geller, writing in World Net Daily, a conservative news source, responded like this: Obama's contempt for American patriots is palpable, and his war on Americans using the NSA, the DHS, Department of Human Services, and the IRS is unprecedented. He is a despicable liar, and history will not be kind to this foreign agent.
Wow.
So that's the right wing. But the general consensus among the elites cited in the corporate media was that the big question is how best to dominate the world. It wasn't how it was put, but is the problem that we tried too hard or not hard enough? What we are trying to do is never questioned. So Bloomberg News, for example, said that in laying out his vision for the U.S. role in the world, the president aimed for the well-trod high ground between isolationists and interventionists. Blah, blah, blah. Conservative David Brooks of the New York Times says, President Obama believes America's problems have not been caused by too much restraint, but by overreach and hubris. And the reactionary call him a conservative, Charles Krauthammer, said that, quote, Obama set out this ridiculous contrast between extreme isolationism on the one hand and extreme, almost a caricature of intervention on the other hand. Intervention, by the way, means military force.
Yes.
It's understood. A Mississippi newspaper captured the essence with their headline, Obama seeks ground between intervention, isolation, in West Point graduation speech. And so that's basically, it was a long speech, it's worth reading, you can find it online, but there's the argument. It's about tactics. The question is not, should the United States dominate the world? It's how. Should we use soft power, which is diplomacy, economic pressure, things like this, or should we throw in the Marines or the Special Forces or the drones or whatever it is? And that was basically everything you could read. The Star-Tribune had, which they do this periodically. I'll hold up the Star-Tribune here. Here's a few days later, the opinion editorial page, and they have a commentary from around the country. Dissects Obama's foreign policy speech. Here's the commentary sources. Foreign Policy Magazine, ultra-establishment journal of foreign policy from inside the Beltway. Slate Magazine, which is owned by, is it NBC? I forget who owns Slate, but it's a very mainstream, prominent website. Bloomberg View. There's two stories from that, from Bloomberg, which is a business news service, the Washington Post, the McClatchy Tribune News Syndicate, another one from the Washington Post. So that's the range of opinion in the Star-Tribune.
Right.
So it's all corporate media. It's all, and they're all pretty much very similar. There's little differences, but not much. Any thought of talking to somebody, from outside the country, who might have an interest in U.S. foreign policy, or people who have been victimized by U.S. military adventures, somebody from Iraq, say, somebody from Afghanistan, somebody from Ukraine. You know, what do people think from outside the country or outside of the Beltway even? You know, or do we have any people speaking from the War Resisters League or from any pacifist group, let alone anti-imperialist groups, or anybody, you know, they didn't call me, for example, to comment.
Exactly.
And I live in the Star-Tribune's home market,
Jeff.
you know.
Gee whiz.
Yeah, I know, they never call me.
But it's important to note, every source there is a source that supported the war in the beginning and has supported the war all the way through, because those are the only legitimate opinions. If you didn't support the war from the beginning, why do you have any right to say anything about it now? But that really seems to be the key to many of these things. Right?
The key phrase I picked out, and we'll cut this short, but because we've got to move on to some other subjects. But the key phrase, I think, from Obama's speech is, I'll just read it. After World War II, America had the wisdom to shape institutions to keep the peace and support human progress, from NATO and the United Nations to the World Bank and IMF. These institutions are not perfect, but they have been a force multiplier. And then he says what I think is the key sentence. They reduce the need for unilateral American action and increase restraint among other nations. So the United States reserves for itself the right for unilateral action, but they set up a world system that increases restraint among other nations. So other nations have to be restrained, and we don't want to have to spend too much energy policing them. So we set up international institutions, which is actually the Obama doctrine, I think, will be seen as a sort of a shifting from a unilateral, raw military power sort of imperial plan to one of a more collaborative, global imperial plan, which I've written about in Nygaard Notes, actually. It's called the New American Way of War.
Well, if only those other nations were more self-disciplined.
Yeah, I know.
And didn't challenge our interests within their countries, we could do this less. And of course, the purpose of many of these wars and occupations is to serve as an example to those other countries who might think of challenging the United States, so that the effects go far beyond the countries that are actually invaded or suffer a war, because most countries don't want to stand up and do that sort of thing. So it makes the imperialism or colonialism in the old days, or all of that stuff, much more successful. I think of the old Aztecs who, sacrificed people every day, and they were captives from other villages. They could just walk in and say, okay, you're going to pay tribute to us from now on. And, people wouldn't challenge them because they saw what happened to those who did. And if you live any place close to Afghanistan, you don't really want to see that happen to your country either. So yes, if we can be less interventionist and still have those countries, quote, restrain themselves, why Obama lays out what looks like a very attractive proposition for the United States. Will he be able to do that? Well, it's another matter.
We have a little clip now from another TV show, not this one. Yes. It's a show that just started in April. It's a comedy show on HBO, starring John Oliver, who worked for many years on the Daily Show, and the show is called Last Week Tonight. And let's just play it's a little 3-minute clip, and I think we'll have something to say about it afterwards.
General Keith Alexander is a decorated military veteran who ran the NSA for the last 8.5 years. During that time, he faced questioning from the highest-ranking officials in the land. But now, he would face the opposite of that.
So first, General, thank you so much for sitting down with me. Looking back on your time at the NSA, do you have any regrets, such as not retiring 1 year earlier?
I thought about that, and You know, at times you think, if I had just retired, somebody else would have had this burden. It would have been wrong for me to leave that for somebody else to do.
Do you think that the NSA is suffering from a perception problem with the American people at the moment, bearing in mind that the answer to that is yes?
Absolutely. You know, the first assumption is that you're collecting on the American people. And therein lies the problem, because the reality is the target is not the American people.
No, the target is not the American people, but it seems that too often you miss the target and you hit the American person standing next to it going, whoa, whoa, him!
But you see, we're not just out there gathering U.S. communications, listening to their phone calls or collecting their emails. But that's the first thing that people jump to.
But you are out there doing that. You're just saying you're not then reading them. You are gathering that data.
No. So in terms of going after U.S. infrastructure or sitting here in the United States, you know, talking to A and B talking in the United States, we aren't collecting that. We don't collect that. We do collect the metadata, a to-from number, date, time, group, and duration of a call. That's all that's in there.
But that's not nothing.
No, that's not nothing.
Significant information, otherwise you wouldn't want it. Is this the argument then that to get the needle you need the haystack?
Well, that's part of the argument.
Right, but people's concerns, I think, are that you're not just taking the haystack, you're taking the whole farm and the county and the state, and you've now got some photos of the farmer's wife in the shower as well.
So NSA is not allowed to go do that on its own. It has oversight. And so what the courts, Congress, and the administration do is say, if you're going to do this, it has to comport with the Constitution. So the question I think the American people really have to ask is, are we doing the right things to protect the nation and our civil liberties and privacy? I am the biggest advocate of freedom of the networks, internet, and if we could come up with a way of segregating all the terrorist communications, one, it would really help us and protect our civil liberties and privacy. And you know, there was a great statement by somebody, you could probably get this into a part of that. You know what we really need to do is all the bad guys need to be on this section of the internet. And they only operate over here. All good people operate over here. All bad guys over here.
Are you talking about Pinterest?
No, you know, bad guy.
Oh, I thought you meant all the worst people in the world in one area, so I thought you were talking about Pinterest, because that seems to be where they kind of assemble.
Oh, could be.
They are the worst people. Oh, look, I've found this gopher bedspread. I'd love that. Shut up. Shut up.
So I've not seen that.
That's what you haven't seen. As director of the NSA, you haven't seen Pinterest.
That's right.
So that's where the terrorists could have been hiding all these.
I want to watch a show. It's quite hilarious, but I think the reason I wanted to have that clip on is some good journalism going on there, and here's what's good about it. First of all, John Oliver doesn't pretend to be objective. He's clearly got a point of view, and that's the way it is. And he makes clear that his questions are aimed not at getting the truth, but at getting the response of a powerful person on the record to be compared with the truth. That's when he says, do you think the NSA is suffering from a perception problem with the American people at the moment, bearing in mind that the answer is yes? What he's saying is, I know, I've done my homework. I want to hear what your version is, and let people decide which is more plausible. So that's journalism to me. Alexander says, we're not just out there gathering U.S. communications. And Oliver says, but you are out there doing that. Right. So it's very unusual for a corporate media interviewer to contradict a powerful source. Again, they're looking to them for answers, not to go on the record and compare their answers. And Alexander also says, we do collect the metadata, blah, 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 phone number, date, time, duration of call. And Oliver says, but that's not nothing. That's significant information. Otherwise, you wouldn't want it. Yeah, so he points out the logical contradiction to Alexander's statement and the implications of the admitted behavior. That's unusual. Now, in case people think that this is only could happen on a high-powered network show or something like that, they asked Oliver, how did you get such a heavyweight? This guy was the head of the NSA for 8 years. How'd you get him? Oliver said, I think we called him. I think that's it. He was a good sport.
Yeah.
So
he was a rather good sport on the clip I watched.
Kind of a sad commentary to think that what I think is some of the best journalism on television. And again, I don't think television is a good place to find journalism, but some of the best journalism on television is in these comedy shows. The Daily Show, this new one I have great hopes for, and it's also it's highly entertaining.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if the sound was turned off, but we were laughing quite a bit just watching the clip. But maybe that's how they get away with it. It's lighthearted, but the zingers come in there, and if you're paying attention, you do get a lot out of it. So I just want to show that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the other interviewers, number one, assume that they're interviewing to find out what's really happening, to get the truth, because the person, of course, would tell them the truth.
Right.
And as you say, they don't challenge it. They don't even pick out the logical contradictions. And the same is true, like covering the president's speech. They analyze what the president says in the speech, but nobody would say, but that isn't what's happening.
Yeah.
That just isn't said, that isn't done.
And the tone, and the reason is the tone of and what's acceptable, the boundaries for these things are set by the corporate environment that is set by the people who own the media institutions, which are certainly on a national level, they're multi-billion-dollar operations, but at the local level too. Our local paper, in fact, was just bought by a billionaire. Or is about to be bought by, I should say.
Yes, is about to be bought. I think the agreement is all made. I hear it's supposed to close like on June 30th.
And this is the Star-Tribune being bought by Glen Taylor.
By Glen Taylor, yeah. I think it's interesting. Glen Taylor has already said that the Star-Tribune is going to be more conservative under him.
If people don't know who Glen Taylor is, by the way, he's a
thank you.
billionaire from Mankato, Minnesota, who already owns the Minnesota Timberwolves, but he made his fortune as a businessman in regional operations in southern Minnesota. He's now worth $1.8 billion.
Yeah.
So, and now he is signed the agreement, or about to sign the agreement to buy the Star-Tribune.
That's correct, yeah. And I think
it's going to be more conservative.
Yeah, that's what he says. Honestly, I am, not too worried about that, because I didn't consider the Star-Tribune to be all that liberal to begin with, though it's portrayed that way by conservatives as, the Red Star and those kind of things like that. It's been getting a little bit more conservative along the lines. But first of all, I think it's probably better than being bought by a huge national chain. I think having some local tie has some actual benefit to it. Given that, though, I think, yes, it may be a little more conservative in the sense that Glen Taylor is clearly a Republican. I believe he served in the state legislature as a Republican at one time. So there's going to be that. But when you have basically corporate-owned media, whether you call it the 1% or you call it the billionaires, which he is, why, you're going to get very much the same perspective regardless. And that perspective is pretty similar across the two different parties, or across, maybe I should say the two parties, not the two different parties sometimes, because at the top of those parties, you have remarkable agreement on whose interests are being served and how it's done. And one of those things is, of course, we saw in our state legislature about the Viking Stadium. And it's interesting that the Star-Tribune, which covered that extensively, had a big self-financial interest in it because it meant that they could sell off their downtown property and make a lot of money off of that. So they were always accused of having some conflict of interest in that, fairly or not.
Yeah, going back as far as the Metrodome in 1982,
right,
83.
That's right, yes, because that had an effect on their property values as well, right? Yeah.
That back then.
So, so they've always had that sort of thing. It's kind of interesting that now that the Vikings is a done deal, all the paperwork's been signed, all that, now the Star-Tribune is sold to the owner of the Timberwolves, who is the next person in line to get a new or refurbished stadium.
Oh, no.
Yes. Yes, the, what's the building called?
Target Center?
The Target Center, thank you. The Target Center, Target Field. Yeah, that those are all, that's the next one to get refurbished with considerable public money. Far more public money than would be allowed without a referendum, but the bill that went through the legislature that overrode the referendum requirement for the Vikings, most people didn't notice it, but it overrode the referendum requirement for the money that's going to be spent on the Target Center. So now our dominant newspaper is once again owned by the folks who have a financial stake in the next stadium. So we have these things going on and on and on. And this ties into the World Cup where,
It does.
again, you know, I mean, obviously Brazil is very proud about having the World Cup there. They love the sport. It's been amazing. But, you know, worldwide, not just in Minneapolis, there's been pushback against these huge stadium projects, huge infrastructure projects, and the huge events that go with them. Because of the disruption of society, the huge amount of money that goes into things other than education and fixing the roads.
Right. Out of the taxes
right.
that are collected off the backs of
Right. It's
very
just
common
real
people.
evident in a country such as Brazil or the United States, where there are such obvious needs that need to be attended to, and yet this is what our politicians get all excited about. This is the bill that has to be passed this session. Forget about welfare grants, they can wait a couple of years. You know, it's that concentration on these playgrounds and these big events is just become universal. And the pushback is more and more. There's been some huge demonstrations around the World Cup, major strikes. The buses got shut down. I don't know if there still are. Even some security guards are on strike. It's chaos. They really wonder how they're going to be able to pull this off with all the turmoil going on around it.
I think another thing that should be kept in mind is the bigger picture of sports. As the one thing that sports do is they get people to look. A lot of people watch sports, whether it's football, soccer on the world stage, or American football in the United States, or baseball or basketball. People look at it, and that's what it's about. In fact, there's just a story on public radio the last couple of days talking about how a lot of the countries who had bid for the Winter Olympics are pulling out their bids.
Yes.
And because what they pointed out in the story that countries often lose money on hosting an Olympics, but what they do, the reason they do it is to increase their standing in the international arena as a kind of competing to be an attractive place to locate a business or to do whatever. Same with stadiums. Minneapolis wants to be a world-class city, so they attract more business because it's part of the sort of civic boosterism, the sort of the image, which is all about attracting attention. It's not necessarily about directly making money. They want taxpayers to invest and lose some of the money to build the reputation of the thing. So it's all buys into this sort of a globalization / competition where everybody is out, every city, every state, every nation is competing with every other one to see how they can pump themselves up and push poor people out of the way and get the dollars flowing. So this is all part of that same syndrome.
It really is, and I mean, it typically, and this goes back, I'm sure, hundreds of years, local newspapers are known for local boosterism. That's one of the big things they do. And yes, it's in their financial interest because any news that happens here is their, you know, scoop, and people pay attention to it. It's very easy to sell papers based on sports or these big events. But yeah, there really is this pushback, not just in Brazil, but as you were saying, a lot of places are backing off from wanting these. Minneapolis decided it did not want to go for the Olympics. They were actually considering that. It had you know, had its own committee working on the Olympics and decided, nah, we're going to back off on the Olympics. We're happy with, of course, this summer is the Major League Baseball All-Star Game, for which already we have a clean zone, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of disruption and a lot of cleaning undesirable elements out of the way, so we have this perfect picture of our perfect city. Never mind what happens to those folks. But the big news, of course, is Minneapolis got the Super Bowl. So
I didn't even
this
know.
This happened while you were gone.
This
and
is
see,
the
you were
big
looking for
news.
what the big news was while you were gone, and it is the big news because it is a huge event, and like all huge events, it's going to cause a lot of disruption. It's going to require a lot of infrastructure, and the thing that bothers me the most about it is after the Viking Stadium, of course, there were the articles by people. U.S. Bank President Richard Davis was one of the key ones in this, saying, you know, buck up, stop whining, get over it. Basically, we won, we shoved this down your throats, and you're going to learn to love it. And, of course, just as everybody loves the Target Field, the Twins baseball stadium, now that it's built, we all love it. one of the things that bothers me in stories is whenever they say, tell us what we all believe.
Right, right.
Oh, yeah.
But that is very much the case. If you just read the media, you would think everybody thinks Target Field is a great thing now that we have it and now that we can see it.
Right.
You know, never mind that we're paying for it for another, well, 28 years or something. But we get this impression always. Everybody loves this. And the same thing with the Super Bowl. The coverage is, well, whatever you think about the stadium, you know, like it or not. Well, at least it brought us the Super Bowl. Right. I have not seen the slightest indication anywhere, except in the comments section where they're scathing, but in the paper as a whole or op-eds, anybody question, well, why did we want the Super Bowl in the first place? Right. With all the problems it brings as well. But that's the deal. And of course, these guys get to look like, wow, look at this great, you know, whatever you think, look at this great favor. We brought you the Super Bowl. Well, they didn't bring the Super Bowl for our benefit. They brought it because it's immensely profitable to them. Right. Oh, and we get a few jobs out of it, you know, mostly minimum wage. So there is a change coming here, and it's getting harder and harder for them to push that. And by the time of 2018, when our Super Bowl comes, who knows what the landscape will look like then.
One of the things I want to try to do is I've got a handout I give at some of my presentations on concrete tips people can use to defend themselves against media propaganda. So we have a little graphic. What I'd like to do is for the next 10 months, there's 10 of them, 10 concrete tips. So for the next 10 shows, I want to try to have a little discussion of each one. The first one, if we can get it, oh, there it is. Propaganda self-defense tip number 1, never use the news media to introduce yourselves to a subject. Now, what does that mean? What then do we do when a news story breaks and we know nothing about it? There's 5 things I can think of. The first point is remember the nature of the corporate media. When I say the nature of the corporate media, that is, corporate media responds to power. The sources they look to for answers to questions are powerful sources. We talked about this earlier in the show. You don't necessarily look for expertise. You don't necessarily look for a variety of opinion. You look for people who are in a position to make something happen. Right. Now, the idea that people who don't have that power might get more influence by having their ideas exposed to a general public might be one understanding of what media should do, but that's not what they do. The farther up the power hierarchy one resides, the more likely one is to endorse and defend the power hierarchy. In other words, the social location of elite media means that as the media gets more concentrated and news reporting gets more concentrated in the elite media, that the people asking the questions are much more connected to people and find more credible people who are in the similar location in the social hierarchy. So that's the kind of people you can expect to be sourced, and that's one of the reasons why that's not a good place to start getting your background and context for stories. Here's an example. Upper class people, we're looking at class as one of the things that define people. Upper class people are accustomed to giving orders. You know, that's what they do. So it seems natural when the U.S. leadership talks about an imperial order where they're setting the rules and they're defining what's perfect, what's not perfect, who gets to run the thing, like Yatsenyuk in Ukraine, as in Victoria Nuland, the Secretary or the State Department employee, said, "Yats is our guy." And that leaked out in a video. Well, that seems normal to people who are used to giving orders. We get to choose the guy. We get to say who gets there. Working class or lower class people are used to taking orders. So, this is a generalization, but those kind of sources you might want to seek out to see what they think of being on the receiving end of some of these orders that are being given. Like people who are having to get out of the way of the stadiums. Do we hear from them? No, we tend to hear from the people building the stadiums. Right. A different perspective. So that's one thing. Remember the nature of corporate media before you start delving into it. The second point, the second thing we can do in the face of introducing ourselves to a subject is get the big picture. Number 2, the tendency of corporate media is to have a reporter on the scene. You send somebody to Afghanistan or to the Olympics or to whatever it is, describing what he or she sees. This can lead to enormous confusion. The idea that the closer you are to something, the better you understand it, is not necessarily true. In fact, some people call this keyhole journalism. that you look through the keyhole and you see what's right in front of you, but you don't see the things behind you, you don't see the things outside the room, you just see what's right in your field of vision. I want to use an example, something I wrote about in Nygaard Notes number 277. This is a long time ago, in November of 2004. Ann Garrels, a reporter from National Public Radio, was embedded with U.S. troops in Iraq. And in November of 2004 was the second Battle of Fallujah, people might remember. And I was writing about it. Here's what Ann Garrels says from the scene. Well, I've been traveling around the north of Fallujah, and I have seen only a couple of civilian casualties who were then treated by the Marines. And the military has not issued any civilian casualty figures at all. The city, frankly, appears to be almost completely deserted, except for the fighters. Shops are shuttered. The houses into which the Marines have moved have been empty. It's even hard to find insurgents, or at least to see them. You see the flashes of fire, but they're sort of an invisible enemy for the Marines. I've only spoken to a few Marines who have actually, in only about a dozen instances, where they've actually shot or shot at someone they've seen. And that's truly remarkable. Yeah. Garrels reports only what she saw, while admitting that even the Marines with whom she's embedded rarely see anybody. So she's the reporter, not seeing anything, reporting that she's not seeing anything. Yeah. On the same day, the Associated Press quoted Lieutenant Colonel Pete Newell, a battalion commander on the 1st Infantry Division in Fallujah, who said, quote, I'm surprised how quickly resistance broke and how quickly they ran away. A force of foreign fighters who were supposed to fight to the death. So here's an example of they saw something, but what they didn't back up to see was the various observers and people with experience in similar situations that were talking about this being a guerrilla operation. The nature of a guerrilla operation is you do not meet a militarily superior force head on. Right. You disappear when they come. Yeah. And you circle around and appear elsewhere. And in fact, violence in other parts of Iraq in subsequent months was much higher. Yeah. They got out. So that's a great example of how you need to get a big picture. You need to understand in this case a little bit about the nature of the struggle in Iraq, which at that point was a guerrilla resistance to an occupation. It was not a face-to-face military confrontation. So when Ann Garrels is reporting that she's not seeing any insurgents and seeing this as a sign of weakness, it's actually probably a sign of at least strategic decision-making, if not strength. So that's a great example of why it's important to, the second point, get the big picture outside of the media before you go into the media, because that's the kind of thing that's going to confuse you. The third point is to practice political empathy. Empathy is the act of putting yourself in the shoes of someone else, which reminds me of a joke which I have to tell. The reason that you've heard the saying, before you criticize someone, it's good to walk a mile in their shoes. And the reason is because that way, when you criticize them, you'll be a mile away and you'll have their shoes. I love that joke. But that is empathy, is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Political empathy is just the broadening of that to imagine a conflict, international conflict or a political conflict from the perspective of the people on the other side of it. So in other words, currently with Ukraine, reverse the roles. Think of Ukraine is to Russia as Mexico is to the United States. If there was a breakaway republic in the Yucatan that the United States considered to be historically part of the United States, and suddenly a major power, Russia, was coming in and saying, no, you can't claim that. The conflict looks different depending on where you're sitting. Right. If you're sitting in Texas, it looks a lot different than you're sitting in St. Petersburg. Right. So that's all you're saying. So, for example, Democracy Now!, after the, I guess, heightened coverage in the early part of 2014 on Ukraine, brought in a specialist from New York University, I think, Stephen Cohen, who gave background and context and said, here's what it looks like from the Russian point of view. Not saying they're right and we're wrong, just saying that these people aren't nutcases who just hate the United States. No. There's a long history, there's something here that can be imagined to motivate what appear to be in the U.S. media as pure lunacy. For example, when we talk about Iran or Venezuela or anybody
Boko Haram.
Boko Haram. It's just they must be crazy because they don't want what we want. And I'm not saying to justify whatever Boko Haram is doing or anybody else is doing, but just to say that these events come out of a context that there's some motivation. These are human beings committing these acts. Even Putin is a human being and has his reasons for doing what he's doing in Ukraine. And you won't get it in the United States media, so it's very hard to be empathetic and practice political empathy, which is very important in trying to understand the news. The fourth point, I think, thing you can do is to seek alternative points of view. And this is another way to get some sort of empathy for the enemy. But the alternative points of view are not simply people from the other side, but like I was saying earlier with interpreting Obama's speech at West Point, talk to some people who are anti-military. Talk to some people who have been working for decades to reduce the military power of the United States, to counter the tendency to empire. That's an alternative point of view. Talk to people getting displaced by stadium building and not just building stadiums. These are the kind of things, these alternative points of view. Talk to socialists if it's an economic issue. Talk to pacifists if it's a military issue. You know, not to say that they are more correct, but it'll broaden the perspective, and you'll say, oh, there's many sides to this story. What do I think about it? And not just go to the powerful sources. So that's point 4, seek alternative points of view. And point 5 is kind of an, just to underline, learn the basic history and context elsewhere before you go to the media. Are we out of time here?
Getting there.
And I'll just mention that this is where you adjust our anchors and categories. An anchor for Boko Haram in the mainstream media is they're Islamist. Another anchor is that they're indigenous resistance to something. What is that? Let's learn about it. And the category is Boko Haram in an us-them construction. They are them, and we are us. And it's always more complicated than that. So that's the 5 things to review here, if we can get the graphic, is to remember the nature of corporate media. 2, get the big picture. 3, practice political empathy. 4, seek alternative points of view. And 5, begin by learning the basic history and context. And that's why you should never use the news media to introduce yourself to a subject. Point 2 next month on News, a Different Perspective.
Very good, very
By the time
good.
we're done with 10 of those, we'll be practically up to our 10th anniversary.
That's right.
We will be. Okay, well,
I think
thanks for tuning in, everyone.
It's been very good to have you back.
Nice to be
Yes,
back.
and Suzanne's going to be with us for a while.
Yes.
for the
I will
June,
be.
July, and August, and who knows, off into the future as News, a Different Perspective
Yes.
looks at whatever happens
Yes.
next.
And an
And first
appreciation
Monday
for our guest host for the time you were gone, Nancy Doyle
absolutely,
Brown.
Nancy.
Too.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I also want to appreciate our technicians, Landon and Dave, who make the whole thing happen. We would just be sitting here talking to ourselves if it wasn't for them. So let's recognize them for the sound and the graphics and the cameras and all that work that makes this work.
Okay, all our shows can be seen on YouTube. Go to Our World Today TV at YouTube, and they're all there. So tune in next month, first Monday.
I mentioned, yes. Very good.
Thank you very much,
All right.
everybody.
Another edition in the can.